Hello, my name is Sarah Boyd, and thank you for coming out today to help us see how we have shared our lives. The story of Black Californians is the story of migration. From the villages of Africa to the plantations of the Old South, our ancestors came as captives. To the northern mountains and the plains of the Midwest, they traveled as runaways and freemen. As they moved out through the country, they brought with them a spiritual strength and a sense of community that influenced all their actions. It helped them fight bigotry and make a place in history far beyond their numbers. Since the early Spanish expeditions of the 1700s, there has been a Black presence in California. A 1790 Spanish census recorded 18% of the population in Alta California as Black. Among the 44 founders of Los Angeles in 1781, 26 of them were Black. When the discovery of gold in early 1848 created a stampede of fortune seekers west from all over the country and abroad, California's population doubled in 1 year. Southern-born gold miners refused to work beside any Black or Chinese, bringing dissension and distrust to the mining camps. The shadow of prejudice against Black people that hung as a dark cloud over much of the nation had inevitably blown westward. As the gold fever died down and gold discoveries tapered off, most free Blacks left the mining country to seek work in the cities, mainly San Francisco and Sacramento. The employment available was mainly as unskilled labor, although some Blacks found jobs as bootblacks, waiters, porters, and cooks. A few opened small businesses. Black slaves brought west by their southern owners to work their gold claims in this slave-free state petitioned the courts for their freedom with some success and joined the job hunters. Wherever Blacks chose to live, however, they dwelt in segregated communities. By the 1850s, a Black cultural center had been established in San Francisco with a library and museum. Black schools opened in Oakland, Sacramento, and San Francisco. The increasing number of Blacks and Chinese immigrants stirred up white fears and resentment. At the Constitutional Convention of 1849 in Monterey, delegates debated whether or not to exclude Blacks from the state. One delegate likened their arrival to the biblical invasion of locusts. No restrictions were placed upon Black people at that time. However, in 1852, the California legislature passed several Black laws to keep Black and whites separated. Included was a fugitive slave law. The new state of California, whose very constitution outlawed slavery, had bowed to the anti-Black sentiment of its new citizens. Several Black conventions were held between 1855 and 1857 to press for defeat of the Black laws. Petitions sent to the state legislature died in the Judiciary Committee. The push for civil rights picked up speed during the Civil War, and finally, the Black laws were repealed. But bigotry remained. It was during the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century that Black people began to arrive in Mayfield and Palo Alto. Seaman Pop Harris came to the Palo Alto area in 1892 and supported himself with his shoeshine business. After saving his money for 9 years, he bought a newly built house on Fulton Street and was finally able to send for his wife and 13 children left behind in North Carolina. He was a familiar figure on Stanford campus, where he had set up his stand at the trolley station. Fran Henson was born in Concord, South Carolina, in a log cabin, and came west with his family when he was a year old. He attended the local schools, including Palo Alto High, where he was a popular football player. While still in his teens, Fran shined shoes with his father, Isaac, at the President Hotel. In 1943, he joined the Army, serving in Europe until his discharge in 1946. By 1948, he had opened Fran's on Lytton Avenue. Many stories are told about Fran's kindness and friendliness. He was adored by the children and admired and respected by the adults. Fran was a community institution until his death in 1984. Frank Soleil, the present owner of Fran's, now Fran's Market, keeps a large picture of Fran on the wall of his store. Sam McDonald, who began life as Emmanuel in Louisiana, came to Mayfield in the spring of 1901, having left his family on the way to Washington. He hoped to work with horses at the Stanford Horse Farm, but became a farmhand in Mayfield instead. His first new friend, the Swedish Fred Beam, had trouble pronouncing Emmanuel, so he began calling him Sam instead. Sam rose from Stanford's teamster to night watchman to Stanford's superintendent of athletic buildings and grounds. Through the years, he continued his education by taking correspondence courses. He was a friend to thousands of Stanford students and liked by everyone. His yearly barbecues were famous. The 450-acre property Sam McDonald bought in La Honda was left to Stanford students in his will. It is now the Sam McDonald County Park off Alpine and Pescadero Creek roads. Dr. Ray Lyman Wilbur once said of Sam, "If I ever have to run against Sam McDonald for the presidency of the university, I'd be mighty afraid of the result." By the early 1900s, the towns of Mayfield and Palo Alto housed a variety of ethnic groups, many of whom worked at Stanford or served on local estates as cooks, gardeners, and house servants. Felix and Maud Natis arrived with their infant son about 1910. Maud worked as a maid for one of the Stanford professors, while her husband Felix did gardening.
Yes, well, as I mentioned before, in those 5 years that my mother worked for the professor over in Stanford, during that time she did have enough money to start to begin buying a new home. So the question was, how is she going to finance a home and how is she going to get one? Of course, in those days, you know, it was very difficult for anybody to try to get a loan for a home. And my mother knew quite a few people through the professor that she contacted one Palo Alto businessman, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Natis, I will see what I can do to have one of the banks okay a loan for you to build a new house there." And that's exactly what happened. So it wasn't easy. It took a long time to finally get somebody to step forward and help her, but it happened.
The increase in number of colored and Oriental residents aroused the fears and prejudices of their white neighbors. In 1920, the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce, in the form of a resolution, attempted to create a segregated district for the Oriental and colored people of the city. Support came from the Native Sons of the Golden West and the local American Legion Post. The Colored Citizens Club of Palo Alto, through its president, Henry Dodson, declared that the segregated district would only create race prejudice and cause race friction. Reference was made to the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Buchanan versus Warley, which had declared segregation ordinances illegal. No segregated zone was ever created. By 1925, over a dozen new subdivisions had restrictions and covenants added to their deeds of trust on properties, prohibiting sale to Chinese, blacks, or anyone not wholly of the white Caucasian race. The decade after World War I brought more new arrivals to the black community. Clarence and Bessie Douglas came in 1921 with the Hoover household and took up residence with them on Stanford campus.
They worked for the Hoovers in Washington. My grandmother as a housekeeper. My grandfather was a gardener, and Hoover was Secretary of Commerce, and they came out here in 21 with the Hoovers to work for them there. And my grandmother did the same thing. She was a housekeeper. My grandfather was a gardener, and they lived on campus with the Hoovers until 1926, when they did purchase a home in downtown Palo Alto on Ramona Street. Mm-hmm. They wanted to remain in California, and I think the Hoovers were probably leaving to go back to Washington because he was going on to other fields. And while my grandparents worked for the Hoovers, they were very instrumental in having a relationship with the Hoovers, and they knew the Hoovers on a very personal basis. And my mother especially talks about Lou Henry Hoover, who was certainly a person that she really admired. And I know one day when she was helping in the kitchen in the dining room, something dropped, and Mrs. Hoover got very upset with her. But later, and my mother ran out of the room, but later actually Mrs. Hoover made amends to her, and she took her on a little trip. And whenever they would travel, my mother would go along with them because she was one of the favorite.
Arriving in 1922 was J.R. and Jerry Harrison, a World War I veteran, and his wife, Ruth. They stayed with friends and rented before buying a lot on Fife Avenue, where they put up a 27-piece house in 4 days. Jerry had been a porter and a barber at the Larkins Hotel on University Avenue, but when his boss discovered that he had actually bought property here, he was fired. Jerry went to another barber shop, dug sewers, and shined shoes until he found a job as a red cap for the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1935. Ruth Harrison operated a successful laundry from her garage. In 1942, Jerry and Ruth were co-organizers of the Santa Clara County branch of the NAACP. Their son, Mel, attended Palo Alto schools, graduating from Palo Alto High in 1940. His interest in sports over the years culminated in his position as head baseball coach at Gunn in the 1970s. Other 1920s arrivals were John and Hester Kennard Harrison and Frank and Pearl Molden. John Harrison attended night school and obtained a job at Early Hewlett-Packard. Hester gave music lessons, worked as a recreation leader, and played the church organ at the University African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Pearl Molden and her husband Mac also became active in the same church. Pearl founded the Community Activities Committee concerned with better education for black youth. Pearl herself completed high school in Palo Alto, graduating with her son William in 1934. Since there were only a few black families in Palo Alto at that time, they held group picnics, dances, and other social activities. Many of these activities were centered in the church. The University AME Zion Church was the first of 2 black churches in Palo Alto.
Actually, that got started, I understand, through a card club. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, what was it?
A group of people got together one night. This was before I was born, I was told, and decided, why don't we form a church? And so they did, on the basis of that. And I thought that was a great idea, you know, but it's amazing that it started in a card club.
By April 1925, the first church building was dedicated. Located on Ramona near Homer, it sat 200 and cost $6,000. When the church was threatened with foreclosure due to the economic downturn of the 30s, white and Asian neighbors alike helped raise enough money to save it. The church located to a new site on Middlefield Road in 1966.
Beginning of the AME Zion Church was formed at my grandmother's house on 330 Copper Street in Palo Alto. And my mother was at that particular meeting, my grandmother, and I think Mrs. Jenny Moore was there, and Mr. Mac Hinson, whom I mentioned before earlier in our conversation, and maybe a couple of other people that I don't remember. So after that meeting, the church really began to take form, and ultimately, through its several moves, built a new church where it's located now on Millfield Road. And the church was a foundation of a lot of things which affected me, because it had activities for black people there, and a few whites, as a matter of fact. So being the sort of a focal point for many activities, I had a lot of things that I could do within the church that helped me, and helped me appreciate how people get together, regardless of who they are, and this sort of thing. So the church was very, very prominent in my life in my early years. And I remember being a superintendent of the Sunday school. I was not a trustee, but I did a lot of work in the church, helped with the dinners to build the church. As a matter of fact, that's another story where a lot of people had to work and serve dinners, trying to pay for the church with the help of some white organizations too.
Plans for the second church, the Jerusalem Baptist Church, were first considered in 1938 during the Depression years to serve the increasing number of black Baptists entering Palo Alto. The church was officially dedicated in 1945 on Sheridan Avenue. It has grown to its present size over the years with the help of its church members. And in 1933, Americus Neely opened one of the first black businesses in Palo Alto, a bicycle shop. He and his wife, Celeste, lived behind the store. Celeste, with a Bachelor of Law degree, earned her real estate license in 1948. As the country sank into the Depression years of the 1930s, people traveled less. It was better to hold on to the job you had in your hometown, no matter how low the wages, rather than go elsewhere where employment was uncertain. In spite of the number of New Deal laws, by 1938, the country's unemployment rate was 19%. All this changed with the onset of World War II. The Depression ended as the country geared up for wartime production. The war not only improved the country's economic outlook, it brought tremendous social changes as well. The draft lottery established by the Selective Service Act began October 29, 1940. Palo Alto sent its share of recruits. In the beginning, only the Army and Navy accepted blacks. Navy recruits like John Gooch went into kitchen work, while the Army draftees were segregated in black units under white command. Many wartime factories would not hire blacks. Thanks to A. Philip Randolph and his brotherhood of sleeping car porters who threatened a protest march on Washington, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting discrimination in defense or government jobs. Thousands of black workers left the South for better-paying jobs in aircraft plants and shipyards in the North and West. Doris Richmond was one of the wartime assembly line workers. She moved to Los Angeles in 1942 and took a job with North American Aviation. Felix Natis came home from Boston, where he had been playing with the Boston Youth Symphony.
I was in church, and this fellow walks in church and says, you know, we need some ship people right away to build ships, because it's very important that we get somebody. So I'm going to all the churches to see how many people I can recruit to go to school to learn about shipbuilding. And I said, well, heck, I'm ready to go. So we went through some classes, not too many of them, I might say, because they really wanted us to get on the docks there where we were building ships. And so, yes, I built ships during the early part of the war, and for about 2 or 3 years, I was in San Francisco at the Western Pipe and Steel shipyards, and after that over in Oakland, the Oakland dry dock over there, we built ships over there. And I got my license as a journeyman ship fitter. That was my title. For about a couple of years, and I had a crew of about 3 or 4 people under me, and they were white, and we had great times. It was very nice association I had with those folks, and we liked each other very much.
Not all black shipyard workers were as fortunate as Felix Natis. Many occupied the most unskilled and menial jobs. We all recall the historic event at Port Chicago, where the survivors of an ammunition explosion refused to continue working under hazardous conditions and were charged with mutiny. At the war's end in 1945, 10 million veterans returned to civilian life, some to continue their schooling under the GI Bill, others to seek jobs in new places. Travel picked up and many headed west. John Gooch arrived in Palo Alto from Florida in the early 1948, transferred to a dry climate on the advice of a Navy doctor. As soon as he decided to come to California, he had a special dream.
When I found out I had to go to California, one night I had a dream that I saw some hills with tall grass, and the wind was blowing the tall grass over the hills. And it was in February, and I wasn't used to seeing grass in February. And I looked at those hills, and it stayed on my mind. When I was on a train coming from San Francisco, driving down the hills, the hills down in Redwood City, that grass, I said, these are the hills I saw in my dream. Then I said, God had directed me to this place. Just as plain as the hills I saw in my dream. So that's how I got here.
Good jobs for blacks were scarce in this area, even for war veterans. So John went to Stanford Hospital as a cook, using the training he had received in the Navy. He worked there until his retirement many years later. Willie Haymes came the following year from Tucson, Arizona, and went into the restaurant business.
And the first person I met when I came here was Mr. Jerry Harris. And that's where I lived for a short while. And I came out to open up a restaurant with my girlfriend. And about another 3 months, we did open the restaurant. And then we moved in the apartment in the back of the restaurant. And we operated that restaurant about a little over a year. And then we closed it up, and then I went to work down to Boaz at the service station. And I worked there for about 2 or 3 months, and I went down to Paddlefords and got a job at Paddlefords, which I was supposed to work there 2 months and go back to Arizona. But I never left the job. I continued to work there for many years.
Like other black newcomers, Willie discovered that job choices were limited here.
And then for many years, I stayed at Paddlefords working there. And matter of fact, I'd like to tell you this, when I started there, black folks didn't have really comfortable jobs. You had to wash cars, you had to deliver cars, and that was about all you could do. There was no black mechanics, no technicians, nothing of that kind. We used to have picnics out at the Pink Horse Ranch. And I was all set to go to this picnic. And all behold, they come to me and told me, you can't go. We will give you $5 and you go out and buy your steak dinner wherever you want to. That sticks out in my mind until now. They would not let blacks go to this picnic. But what really upset me, the Lincoln Mercury dealer down the street was taking his blacks to the same place. But our company didn't do that. So that sticks out in my mind. Eventually, about 2 or 3 years later, they did change it. Not only could we not go as black, but the women couldn't go either. They was white, but they couldn't go either. Just the men, white men could go. But they came around about 3 years later and said, well, the owner said that they would accept the black to come to the picnic. And they come around and offered to take us. And I refused to go.
Lillian and Raymond Herring arrived in California as young newlyweds. After a brief stay in Berkeley with relatives, they came to Palo Alto, low in funds and with a 2-year-old daughter. In the scarce housing market, they were fortunate to rent a room in a house on El Camino.
He had an offer to work at this hotel, and we would eventually get out of the basement apartment that we had in Berkeley.
The housing crunch that developed in the Bay Area during World War II continued into the post-war years. In Palo Alto, people of minority groups lived in small areas around California Avenue or downtown. A successful project of interracial housing was developed in 1950 on Lawrence Lane near Colorado Avenue by the Palo Alto Fair Housing Committee. A gradual approach to neighbors in the area prepared them for acceptance of this innovative housing. Still, a poll taken 2 years later by the same committee indicated that more than 70% of residents who answered would only rent or sell to Caucasians. A real estate agent at this time remarked that people don't go where they are not wanted. After Willie Haymes sold his restaurant with its own living quarters, he and his wife started looking for a house.
That's when we started looking out for ourselves, matter of fact, we were looking for a house, but we spotted this lot, and we decided to buy the lot. So we had to go through a lawyer to find out who owned the lot, how much they wanted for the lot. And he found out, and then he come back to us and he told us, he said, this lot is for sale, but there's a stipulation in it that it's not to be sold to Mongolians, blacks, or Mexicans, or Indians, or whatever. But he said the people who are in charge of it now say they will forget about this. So we got the lot. And after about a few months or so, we had enough money to hire a contractor to build our home on it.
Most black people at this time had little collateral, a business, another home, a savings account, and so they needed help from a lawyer to arrange for a home loan and a mortgage. Sometimes a person's employer would put in a good word to help ease the purchase. A good lawyer often served another purpose too. Occasionally, a real estate agent would neglect to reveal a structural defect or a lien on the property, such as a second mortgage. Black people were considered fair game by the unscrupulous. The behavior of the children frequently reflected the attitudes of their parents.
When our home was being built, every afternoon or every other afternoon, we would ride by and, take a look at it and see how they was doing with it, what progress they was making. So this one particular afternoon, we was inside of this frame, and this young boy came up, a little white boy. He come up and he looked at us and he said, "Get out of this white man's house."
After living at several different locations, including the Natis rental house on Fulton, the Herrings bought property on Colorado and began to design their house.
In planning this home, my husband had seen a home that he liked because he did a lot of painting and was in many homes, mostly worked through the Stanford campus for the professors there at Stanford. And from one job to another, this is how he operated. And he saw this home, and he thought he would like to have one like it. And once we got the property in a position where we could afford to build, because in the meantime we sold off a couple of lots that enabled us to build our own home. And he drew the plan, and we set the plans up on a card table and left it there. And when I'd come home from work, I'd move one room. We'd cut the rooms out, and I would move it one way and then the other, and he'd come and he'd move it this way and then the other. But finally, through a couple of years before we really built the home, but we had it there on plans, on the table and plans, and we finally came to some conclusion, and we started building this home. And we had to have a carpenter who had a license in order to build, And through cooperation with this young builder, we built our own home, through his advice and my husband's know-how. And we sort of got the plumber and the painters and on our own in a sort of a contract like. And so we started from the ground up. Yeah.
Doris and Cole Richmond came to Palo Alto in 1949 after a brief stay in San Francisco, drawn here by the eucalyptus trees. They built a house on Chestnut Street and became active members of the community. As a charter member of the University AME Zion Church, Doris was on hand to welcome newcomers and serve them home-cooked meals. She was the first black librarian to work in the Palo Alto Library system. Doris's community activities were recognized in a special manner in 1997 with the Lifetime of Achievement Award from the Avenidas. Through the years, black people settled into their new neighborhoods, shopped at local stores, and sent their children to local schools. Some neighbors welcomed them, others did not. Felix Natis recalls playmates from his childhood and some of his early school experiences.
The only playmates I had were the next door neighbors, Mr. Hinson's family. As I mentioned before, we're almost the same age. And there were 3 of them in the family at the time. And we played together, and we played all kind of games together. And of course, when it comes to other activities, at that time, we always had the church, which we probably have a lot to say about that later in your conversation. But there were no white kids who we played with in that area. There were white kids, yes, but they didn't want to play with us. And we didn't try to negotiate any kind of friendship or anything like that. We just sort of went about our business, and that was that. When I went to school, my very first experience in school, they didn't have a kindergarten in those days, in Palo Alto anyhow. So I was thrown into the first grade right off the bat with other kids. And we got along very well. There were lots of white kids there, and I believe that there were only 2 of us, the black kids, in the school, the whole school, as I recall. So what did that mean? It meant that we had to sort of get acquainted with the white folks, and which we did. I did have a couple of white kids that I played with. We had a good time. And so that was quite an experience, and I sort of began to like that idea of playing with a lot of people, and not necessarily black kids, but other kids. There were a couple of Orientals in there too, but not too many of those, as I recall.
Lillian Herring and her family lived on a diversified block where neighbors helped one another.
And in the neighborhood, it was not too many people in the neighborhood, and they were mostly in our own situation, struggling to make ends meet. And one of the, I think this man, that his family lived a couple of blocks from us, but he would pass our home every day. And he would see us out there digging and working in the trenches, trying to get this place built. And I don't know whether it was admiration or what, but one day he came by and he said, "Listen, I'm going to come over and help." And sure enough, he did. He was, he installed glasses for windows, you know. So it was another contact. So when we needed the windows, well, he was right there in the neighborhood to do it. So, and this is how so much of our work was done. The neighbors would see us out there, family working, and I don't know whether it was admiration or wow, you know. But this is how we sort of blended into the community. And another neighbor of ours is a young Chinese family that lived across from us. And so we became neighbors, and her children was the same age as my girls. And so when it was time for her to go to kindergarten, my youngest one was more or less like a big sister. She would look out for her and walk with her to school and back. So it was one of those growing up neighborhoods. Everyone was so concerned about the next meal and how to pay for my home, and so little attention was made to who you are, where you came from.
In high school, Felix experienced some exclusion from activities, which continued into his college years at San Jose State.
And as far as being asked to be any of the officers in high school, no one asked me to participate in that kind of thing. And I know that a lot of other people were asked to become commissioners, as we called it, as they called it, to do certain things for the newspaper and other activities, but I was never called for any of that. But I did participate in the music program, and I loved that very much because I was very interested in that. We had very good teachers, and we all got along just fine in that group. I belonged to the orchestra and band and all that kind of thing. And then, so I went on to San Jose State and majored in music, and I was going for a secondary teaching credential, and something happened there that I decided that I would like to do something else, but still in the music line.
Lillian Herring also noticed some social changes as her daughters entered high school, and she did something about it.
Not so much during their younger years, but as they grew into the teenage kind of situation, then we saw a pulling away, a sort of a separate kind of way to go. And other children were going to Yosemite, they were going to skiing and all that kind of activities, and they felt sort of left out, with children, their classmates coming back telling them about, I was up in the snow and I was on skis and that sort of thing. So I joined a group, what they call the Jack and Jill. And that was one of the first groups, and it was association of mothers, black parents, who got together. The parents had to belong before the children could belong, and they organized activities for the youth, and we had our little meetings, and we took them to Yosemite, we took them to parks, and we took them to different kinds of social activities, but that was chaperoned, and everyone was the parents were there, and it made it easier for them to have classmates or friends, because there was few classmates, because these children were from San Jose and some of them were from San Francisco, that we would take on these trips. And we'd usually go around the February Washington birthday time, and we'd take a busload to Yosemite for a weekend, and it worked very well. They had loads of fun. So it was in that period of time that we felt this separation of their friendship with their classmates when it came to the social part, and they grew up, in with boy-girl kinds of things. That's when we found the difference. But it was not an issue per se, because the whole point was giving them the opportunity to have the experiences that other children had. And to me, that was the bigger part of it.
As Palo Alto moved through the 1950s and into the 60s, the city expanded to the south and into the western hills. In 1958, local churches banded together to push for open housing. Joseph Eichler's subdivisions were constructed available to buyers of any race, color, or creed. In 1961, a number of local clergy and laymen traveled to Mississippi and Alabama in support of civil rights protesters. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, a large parade of mourners and civil rights activists marched down University Avenue. The year 1970 saw the election of the first black to the Palo Alto City Council, Roy Clay, after Cole Richmond had run unsuccessfully the year before. In the 1970s, however, Cole served on the Human Rights Commission. It wasn't until 2001 that the second black, Hillary Freeman, was elected to serve on the council. June Fleming, who had come to Palo Alto in 1966 with her family, initially worked as a librarian before becoming the first black city manager in 1992. The schools gradually became multicultural as Palo Alto's population diversified. But some believed that more could be done. In 1976, Margaret Tinsley, a Palo Alto native and Cubley High School graduate, allowed her name to be used in a lawsuit brought against local school districts to force them to become more racially diverse. After 10 years, the settlement created the voluntary transfer program. Its threefold purpose was to increase the number of minority students in mostly white school districts, to improve the educational situation in the Ravenswood district, and to improve mutual cooperation among districts. Even though her children had already finished school before the verdict was announced, Margaret Tinsley knows that it has helped others and will continue to do so. In June of 1998, the first class of Tinsley students graduated from Palo Alto and Gunn High Schools.
My name is Becky Cohen Vargas, and I'm the Director of Elementary Education for the Palo Alto Unified School District, and also the Director of the New Teacher Program. And I was actually a student, graduated in 1969 from Coverly High School, and that was before the Tinsley case. And we went from a very white student population to the beginning of some students of African American descent coming in from East Palo Alto through a program called the Sneak-In Program. And so that was our first exploration of intercultural communication and diversity within the Palo Alto schools in my experience. And I'm now coming back 30 years later after having been a student, and actually actively I was on the multicultural task force as a student representative. Now I come back as a district employee and I look and I say, what's changed? One thing I can see has changed is there are more students of different ethnic backgrounds in the district, and we do have the BTP program, so we have a consistent group of students coming from East Palo Alto. I still think the district is not as diverse as other areas that I've lived in the Bay Area, but we are very committed to stay focused on the needs of students of what we call underrepresented minorities, African American, Latino, and some Asian groups, and that term comes from the University of California, the students that are still underrepresented on their campuses. And we now have worked very hard to have a goal as part of our strategic plan. It's a goal that we say school climate and the educational outcomes will be improved for underrepresented minorities, resulting in a reduction of 25% of the achievement gap. And we have that goal because although African American and Latino students are doing better than many times their white counterparts across the state, they still aren't doing as well as the white and Asian students in our district. And in order to respond to that goal, we're doing a lot of different things. We're working on teacher attitude and expectations by having workshops and opportunities to learn about working with students of different ethnic backgrounds and issues of race. And so we send teachers to Beyond Diversity and to the Museum of Tolerance, two places where they will get anti-racist curriculum and a chance to examine their own biases and make sure their expectations are very high for all their students. We also have academic programs to work with students who are below grade level to help them catch up to grade level, and those are reading literacy programs in the summer, as well as the academy, which works with students during the school year. We also have opportunities for teachers, and this is very important, to learn how to apply strategies of differentiation right in their own classrooms, because that's really where it needs to be. Students need to get an opportunity to be taught at their own level right in their own classroom. And we do that through differentiation workshops. And we're aiming to help each student, and we monitor them student by student, achieve at their highest level and their greatest potential. And that is not only getting the students below grade level to grade level, but getting students who are at grade level to the highest levels. And we think we need to do this through looking at our own attitudes, through monitoring student progress, and through having additional supports to help students. So that's a lot of what's happening right now. And I just want to close with one wonderful program, the program Foundation for College Education, that helps students get to the higher levels and to college and university programs.
We can see that the coming years will be different for our children and their children. But will they know how we reached this point? On January 20, 2002, the eve of a holiday dedicated to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a column by Loretta Green ran in the San Jose Mercury News. Its title was, "Young People Vital to Keeping the Dream Alive." Here is an excerpt from that column. Sometimes when young people have no real-life connection to people back in history, they become just that, history. They didn't know him, but they know that they are expected to. They don't feel that rise of pride and emotion that they sense in the conversations of their grandparents, but they earnestly and valiantly try. Likewise, singing "We Shall Overcome" does not tighten the throats of those born decades past the days of the March on Washington, the bloody Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, the flaming Freedom Riders buses, or the brave and stoic lunch counter student sit-ins. Today's young people don't identify with that kind of humiliation. They don't know about scary Mississippi nights. They don't know about fear or harm from another human that dries the mouth into parchment, scalds the body, and clangs and roars in the eardrums. I thank God for that. But now that they live a life where eating in restaurants and voting, or being National Security Advisor, San Francisco Mayor, or Brown University President are realities for African Americans, will they know how to fight for themselves? Will young people of all colors, religions, and ethnicities know that injustices will happen and that they must remain smart and stalwart men and women in the face of it? May they appreciate it when some selfless soul steps up who is willing to jeopardize his or her safety to head the line, and they must in turn be sure that there is a line.
It's just a pleasure to be among all of you smiling faces this afternoon. I am the other half of the Richmond family. Frankly, I would like to start with just something that's very, very dear to me of why we ended up in Palo Alto. As Cole mentioned, he was transferred from Southern California to Northern California because of his position. And I was very skeptical about coming because, you know, I am the youngest of my family, and my grandmother kept saying, well, your husband's gone, you gotta go. So anyway, it starts with actually in San Francisco, which I never did unpack. And then the second, the second week, my brother-in-law said, let's go down the peninsula. So we got in the car and we came down the Great Highway, which is El Camino Real, as you all know. And we came, down Burlingame, got to Menlo Park, Redwood City. When we got to, as you know now, there's Stanford Shopping Center on that side. That was nothing but just a field, just fields, because you could see the fog would come up. So when we got to the entrance of Stanford, whom I had read, and I was always very, very inquisitive as when it comes to horticulture. So when we got to all the eucalyptus trees, I said, stop the car. He said, why? Are you okay? I said, I'm fine. Pull over. So I said, I need to walk. And as you know, there are red roses along that fence. And the roses were blooming, and I came on down on this other side. There was not no town and country village there. That was just nothing but land. And I like land. So I said to him, let's go down a little farther. So she said, well, it won't be very far because my mother lives right here in South Palo Alto. I said, good, let's go. So when we got to Page Mill, and he made his turn, and he came up Park Boulevard. Park Boulevard was not Park Boulevard. That was 3rd Street. If you go to the library, main library, which I was a part of many, many years, you have one of the greatest persons there, Steve Steiger, whom I still say I love him. Well, he's young. He's young. Very cooperative, very knowledgeable, and as I said, when we came up, she said, well, come in, children. Well, I had black hair then. Oh, we went right on in. Now let's have a bite to eat. So we had the bite to eat. And then she said, well, where are you working? And goes to San Francisco. She said, well, why don't you come down here and just move and live with us for a while? And I said, that's fine with me. So what we did, we stayed with her for about 6 months. And then further on, if you are familiar with South Palo Alto, we've been there 55 years. So there was this land. So I see the lot next to us, the lot on the corner. There was Smith's Nursery, which took up the whole block. That was the only thing was there. And then there were a lot of Spanish people that had owned property in South Palo Alto. And so I said, well, there's lots there. So we inquired and we bought the lot. And then we built the house. And that's the way that we ended up. Then come back to my career. When my children got old enough, I started working at the library part-time. And then I said, well, because somebody has to keep the children. I was always very adamant about my children. So then I would take the red wagon, go to Pierce Park, and there was a lady there, and she said, well, would you like to work? I said, yes. And I don't know who here would even remember the Department of the Recreation that was over the city of Palo Alto at that time, Alex Smith. I'm going back a real long way. Anyway, she said, well, how about the library? I said, well, that's fine. So I went to the library. I had nobody to go with me. I had no affirmative action. I just went. And when I walked in, now this is the clincher. The lady looked around and she says, why are you here? And I looked at her and I said, I'm here for employment. So at that time, it was Mr. Fred Mulholland. He was the librarian, and he looked out and he said, oh, that's Doris. Tell her to come on in. Here's a black lady out here that says she wants a job. And he says, come in, fill out the application. I am the very first black person that was hired by the city of Palo Alto in the library department. Now you see everybody but the footprints of Doris's. Then we moved. I want to give you just a visual as far as the building goes of the old library downtown. You walk in, there was 8 marble steps, just beautiful. And then you would go to the door, and the doors were kind of cedar-like. And then you would open, but the goals had the ornate gold around them. As you walked in, to the right was not tech services. We're catalogers there. And then in the center, on the left-hand side, was the director of libraries. Everybody was cohesive and everybody knew everybody else. And then you had the downstairs. Now that's where the history of Palo Alto. The archives started there. When we moved in 1966, I think I'm the last one that's living, because everybody else has passed on. Then I helped move from downtown to main library here at 1213 Newell Road. So it has been a wonderful experience, and I don't say I like Palo Alto. Somebody asked me where did I live. I told her I had 3 homes. And she said, well, where are your 3 homes? And I said, 260 Chestnut, 1213 Newell Road, and 3549 Middlefield Road. And I said, that's where God is, so that's my home. So what I am saying is that if you pursue and encourage, the history is very, very important, because without the history, we won't have anything else to go by. I encourage each and every one to go to the main library and tell Steve, I'm here to learn. The first of the Palo Alto Times that's there, 1893. You know how each one of them, how much it weighs? I know, because I was there for 30 years, and I don't know how many, as far as that part goes. Before we got the front lift, the back lift, you had to bring them up on the truck. But God is good, because I'm still here, and I'm still learning. So I love you, and have a very good New Year. Bless you. Thank you.